My name is Dan Oddie, Engineering and Technical Sales for Detroit Speed, and today we're going to show you how to install our bolt-on rear quadrant link for the 1973 to 87 square body GM trucks. Raise the vehicle on jack stands so that the frame is level with the ground and remove the bed. You may also need to remove the exhaust if necessary to make installation easier. Remove the rear axle bumper bracket from both sides of the frame. Remove the factory shocks from both sides of the vehicle. If your vehicle has an upper shock stud, remove them from both sides of the frame. Remove the stock leaf springs from the rear axle and frame. Make sure the rear axle is supported so the rear brake lines are not in tension. Remove the front and rear leaf spring brackets from both sides of the frame. With the rear frame rails level, locate the center line of the frame notch location on the side of the frame. Using the top rear hole of the front leaf spring bracket, measure back 21 3/8 inches. Mark this center line location. Use a straight edge and extend your center line along the side of the frame rail. Use the template and trace the frame notch cutout onto the side of the frame rail. Use a straight edge and transfer the cut lines to the bottom side of the frame rail. Cover the fuel tank with a welding blanket. Cut along the traced lines to notch the frame rail. Grind all edges smooth. Locate the frame notch bracket assemblies from the kit. Test fit the frame notch assembly to the frame. Using the bracket assemblies, transfer punch 7/16 and 3/8 holes in the brackets to the frame rails. Remove the bracket assemblies and drill out all locations. Install the frame notch bracket assemblies to the frame using the provided 7/16 by 1 inch bolts, nylock nuts, and washers. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolts. Torque all 7/16 inch hardware to 50 foot-pounds. Place a spacer over the threads of the jounce bumper. Install the jounce bumper and spacer into each frame notch assembly at the C-notch using the provided 5/16 nylock nut, washer, and tighten. Slide the track bar crossmember assembly in between the frame rails. The crossmember will line up with the holes you drilled on the top and bottom side of the frame rails for the 3/8 hardware. Install the track bar crossmember to the frame by using the 8 provided 3/8 by 1 1/4 inch bolts, nylock nuts, and washers. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolts. Install the left-hand side hardware first and then the hardware on the right-hand side, as those holes are slotted on the bottom. The bolts will need to be installed from the bottom on the bottom frame side and from the top on the top frame side. torque to 30 foot-pounds. Install the upper shock mount assemblies to the frame notch assemblies. The upper shock mounts will slide between the tabs of the frame notch assemblies. Use the provided 3/8 by 3.5 inch long bolts, nylock nuts, and washers. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolts and torque to 30 foot-pounds. Drill out the 6 holes on each side where the factory front leaf spring brackets were installed using a 15/32 drill size. Install the frame bracket assemblies using provided 7/16 by 1 1/4 inch long bolts, nylock nuts, and washers to hold the frame brackets in place. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolts. Drill 2 holes per frame rail using the brackets as a template to a final drill size of 15/32. Install the remaining hardware and torque all 7/16 bolts to 50 foot-pounds. Cut off the factory lower shock mount from the passenger side of the rear axle. Grind smooth for a clean finish. Place the upper axle bracket assembly on top of the factory leaf spring pad so the pin locates in the hole on the leaf spring pad. Locate the lower axle bracket assemblies underneath the upper axle brackets. Bolt them together using provided 1/2 inch by 6 inch long bolts, nylock nuts, and washers. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolts and torque to 40 foot-pounds. Install the upper and lower swivel links to the frame bracket assemblies using provided 9/16 by 3 3/4 inch bolts, nylock nuts, and washers. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolts. Do not torque at this time. Install the upper and lower swivel links into the rear axle brackets using the provided 9/16 by 3 3/4 inch bolts, nylock nuts, and washers. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolts. Do not torque at this time. Use a floor jack to raise the rear axle so that the distance between the upper and lower shock mount mounting holes is 15 inches from center to center. This will be your nominal ride height. Torque the 9/16 swivel link hardware to 110 foot-pounds. Position the track bar axle bracket assembly on the back side of the rear axle tube so it locates the track bar clamp plate assembly. Bolt them together using provided 7/16 by 5.5 inch bolts, nylock nuts, and washers. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolts and leave the hardware loose for now. Verify the frame rails are level to the ground. Locate the track bar axle bracket assembly against the inside of the passenger side link bracket assembly. Rotate the track bar axle bracket assembly so the surface with the track bar mounting hole will be perpendicular to the ground and square to the axle tube. Torque the 7/16 hardware to 35 foot-pounds and recheck the track bar bracket to make sure it remains level. Check the pinning angle as it should be level to the ground. Install the track bar swivel link into the track bar crossmember assembly and then into the track bar axle bracket. Use the provided 9/16 by 3 3/4 inch long bolts, nylock nuts, and washers. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolts and torque the 9/16 hardware to 110 foot-pounds. Next, assemble the shocks by placing the coilover spring over the top of the shock, followed by the spring perch. Install the retaining ring onto the shock mount. Press the spring seat up onto the retaining ring so it locks in place. Thread the spanner nut up to the spring so it stays in place on the shock. Position the body side of the shock up to the upper shock mount. Apply anti-seize to the threads and install the bolt and spacer to the upper shock mount hole and through the monoball of the shock. Install the provided 1/2-inch nylock nut onto the bolt. Adjust the height of the rear axle and install the lower shock bolts and spacers through the lower shock mounts and through the monoball of the shocks. Apply anti-seize to the threads of the bolts and install the provided 1/2-inch nylock nut onto the bolt. Tighten the upper and lower shock bolts. Once you have everything installed and you're sure that everything's tightened and torqued, you want to put your wheels on and put the truck back in the ground. At that point, you can put your bed back on and anything else that you might have taken off during installation. So once you're on the ground, you're going to want to check your wheelbase, your pinion angle, and verify that your ride height is where you want it. And then you're ready to roll. If you have any questions, call us at Detroit Speed at 704-662-3272 or visit us at DetroitSpeed.com.